Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The sun was setting over the vast expanse of the Montana Territory, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed to set the mountains ablaze. Elijah Crawford stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, watching the colors shift and fade as they did every evening, yet finding no comfort in their beauty. At 38 years old, he was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, owner of over 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, and yet he had never felt more alone in his entire life. The Crawford Ranch had been his father's dream, built from nothing but determination and sweat. When his parents had died in a fever epidemic 12 years ago, Elijah had taken over at 26, expanding the operation beyond anything his father could have imagined. He had worked himself to the bone, sacrificing everything for success. Now he had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, a house with 12 rooms he never used, and not a single soul to share it with. His foreman, Hank Williams, had told him just last week that he needed to find himself a wife, settle down, and start a family before he grew too old and set in his ways. Elijah had laughed it off, but the words had lingered in his mind like a splinter he could not remove. It was on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after that conversation, when everything changed. Elijah had ridden into the small town of Copper Springs to collect supplies and check on a shipment of new cattle arriving by train. The town was bustling with its usual activity, miners and ranchers mixing with merchants and travelers passing through to destinations unknown. He had just stepped out of the general store when he saw her for the first time. She was standing near the water trough, trying to calm a frightened horse that had apparently been spooked by a passing wagon. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days. But it was the way she spoke to the animal, soft and gentle, her hands moving with practiced ease, that caught his attention. She was not afraid of the beast, even as it reared and pulled against its reins. Without thinking, Elijah crossed the dusty street to help her. Together they managed to calm the horse, and when she finally looked up at him with eyes the color of spring grass, he felt something shift inside his chest that he could not explain. Her name was Clara Bennett, and she had arrived in Copper Springs just 2 days prior, traveling alone from Missouri after the death of her grandmother, the only family she had left in the world. She was 26 years old, possessed of a quick wit and a stubborn streak that became apparent within the first 5 minutes of conversation. She was also, she informed him with a directness that caught him off guard, looking for work. Elijah found himself offering her a position at the ranch before his mind had fully caught up with his mouth. He needed someone to help with the cooking and cleaning, he explained, as his housekeeper had recently left to care for her ailing mother in California. Clara had studied him with those remarkable eyes, considering, before finally agreeing to a trial period of 1 month. The first week was an adjustment for everyone. Clara was not accustomed to the scale of the Crawford Ranch, and Elijah was not accustomed to having anyone in his house who challenged him the way she did. She reorganized his kitchen without asking permission, told him his curtains were depressing and needed to be replaced, and insisted on eating meals at the same table rather than serving him separately as the previous housekeeper had done. The ranch hands were charmed by her immediately. She learned all their names within 2 days and began packing extra biscuits in their lunch pails. She tended to scrapes and bruises with a gentle efficiency that spoke of practice, and she never complained about the long hours or the endless work. But it was the evenings that Elijah came to treasure most. After dinner, when the work was done and the house grew quiet, Clara would sit with him on the porch, and they would talk. She told him about her life in Missouri, about her grandmother who had raised her after her parents died in a riverboat accident when she was just 7 years old. She spoke of dreams she had once had of seeing the ocean, of traveling to places she had only read about in books. In turn, he found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, about the guilt he carried for not being present when his parents died, about the loneliness that had become so familiar he had stopped recognizing it as anything other than normal. By the end of the second week, Elijah knew he was falling in love with her. It was a terrifying realization for a man who had convinced himself he was content alone. He began to notice everything about her, the way she hummed while she worked, the small crinkle that appeared between her brows when she was concentrating, the sound of her laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for far too long. He also noticed that she seemed comfortable with him in a way that gave him hope. She sought out his company, asked his opinions, remembered small details he mentioned in passing, and brought them up days later, when their hands brushed accidentally while passing dishes or reaching for the same book. She did not pull away immediately, and sometimes he caught her looking at him with an expression he could not quite decipher. It was on a Sunday afternoon near the end of her third week at the ranch that Elijah finally gathered his courage. They had taken a ride out to his favorite spot on the property, a small hill that overlooked a creek where wild horses sometimes came to drink. The day was warm, and they sat together on a blanket Clara had packed, eating sandwiches and watching the clouds drift across an endless blue sky. He told her then, with all the eloquence he could muster, which was not much, that he had developed feelings for her. He spoke of how she had changed his life in ways he was still discovering, how the house felt like a home for the first time since his parents had passed, how he could not imagine going back to the emptiness that had defined his existence before she arrived. He asked her, his heart pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it, if she might consider staying not as his housekeeper, but as something more. Clara was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking. She stared out at the horizon, her expression unreadable, and Elijah felt his hope begin to crumble with each passing second of silence. When she finally turned to face him, there were tears in her eyes. She cared for him too, she admitted, more than she had planned to, more than she had thought possible in such a short time. But caring was not enough, she said, her voice breaking on the words. He was a wealthy rancher, one of the most powerful men in the territory, and she was a penniless orphan, with nothing to offer but herself. The gap between them was too vast, the change too overwhelming. She had spent her whole life in a small cabin, scraping by on whatever her grandmother could earn. Sewing and mending. She did not know how to be the mistress of an estate this size, how to host the dinner parties and social gatherings that a man of his standing would be expected to attend. She would embarrass him, she was certain of it, and eventually he would come to resent her for it. "Seems you are too big a change for me," she told him, the words falling like stones between them. "This life, this ranch, everything you are. I am not built for it, Elijah. I would only disappoint you." He tried to argue, to tell her that none of those things mattered to him, that he did not care about dinner parties or social standing, that all he wanted was her. But she shook her head, resolute in her decision, and asked him to take her back to the house. They rode in silence, and that night she stayed in her room, and for the first time in weeks, Elijah ate dinner alone. The following days were agony. Clara continued her work, professional and distant, the easy companionship they had built replaced by a politeness that felt worse than coldness. Elijah threw himself into ranch work, spending long hours in the saddle, trying to outrun the ache that had settled in his chest. But no matter how tired he made himself, sleep would not come, and he lay awake each night replaying their conversation, searching for the words he should have said. It was Hank who finally confronted him, finding Elijah in the barn late one evening, brushing down his horse with more force than necessary. The old foreman was not a man given to speeches, but he spoke his piece that night with a bluntness that left no room for misunderstanding. He told Elijah that whatever had happened between him and the young lady was his business, but that a man who let pride or fear stand in the way of love was a fool of the highest order. He had seen the way they looked at each other, and he had been in this world long, enough to know that kind of connection was rarer than gold and twice as valuable. "Life is short," Hank said, leaning against the barn door, "and loneliness has a way of becoming permanent if you let it. You might be rich, boss, but money cannot keep you warm at night, and it surely cannot love you back." He left Elijah alone with those words, and they echoed in the quiet of the barn long after his footsteps had faded. The next morning, Elijah rose before dawn. He washed and dressed with care, then sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter, choosing each word with deliberation. When Clara came downstairs to start breakfast, she found him waiting, the letter in his hands. He asked her to read it, just read it, before she said anything. She took the pages with trembling fingers, and he watched her face as she absorbed his words. He had written about his childhood, about the years of loneliness that had shaped him, about the walls he had built around his heart so high that he had forgotten there was anything behind them worth protecting. He wrote about the moment he first saw her, calming that frightened horse with nothing but patience and kindness, and how something inside him had recognized something inside her. He wrote about the evenings on the porch, the conversations that had felt like coming home after a long journey he had not known he was taking. And then he wrote about the things she had said, her fears about not belonging in his world, and he addressed them one by one. He did not need a society wife who could host elaborate gatherings. He did not care about impressing anyone or maintaining any kind of social standing. He had spent years building this ranch, and in all that time, he had never once built anything worth keeping, except the land itself. She had shown him in just a few short weeks what it meant to have someone to share a life with. The house, as just wood and nails, without her in it. The money was just numbers on a page. She was the only thing that had ever made any of it mean something. He was not asking her to change, he wrote. He was asking her to let him change, to let him become the man she deserved, to learn together how to build a life that belonged to both of them. He would sell the ranch if that would make her happy, move to a small cabin if that was what she needed. He did not care about the size of the life they built, only that they built it together. When Clara finished reading, she was crying openly, the tears streaming down her face and falling onto the pages she clutched in her hands. She looked up at him, this wealthy rancher who was offering to give up everything for her, and she saw for the first time not the gap between them, but the bridge he was trying to build. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and threw her arms around him, and he held her like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. She whispered against his chest that she was terrified, that she had never been more afraid of anything in her life, but that she was more afraid of walking away from him than she was of staying. They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony by the creek, where he had first confessed his feelings. Hank stood as witness, along with the ranch hands who had become like family to them both. Clara wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Elijah thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. In the years that followed, they built the life they had dreamed of together. Clara learned to manage the household with confidence that grew with each passing season, and Elijah learned to leave his work at the barn door and be present for the moments that mattered. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up knowing they were loved beyond measure. The ranch continued to prosper, but it was no longer the center of Elijah's world. That place belonged to the woman who had once told him he was too big a change for her, and who had been brave enough to change her mind. And every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, they sat together on the porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and crimson, finding in its beauty a comfort that had eluded him for so many lonely years.